Hi everyone, my name is Rachel, and today I'm sharing something that completely turned my world upside down and taught me the hardest lesson about family boundaries. I never thought I'd need to learn. Picture this: you work overtime for months, save every penny, finally buy your dream car, only to come home one day and find it gone. Not stolen by strangers, but sold by the very people who raised you. When I discovered my parents had taken my car and sold it to fund my brother's spring break trip to Cancun, I faced a choice that would either make me a doormat forever or force me to stand up for myself in the most dramatic way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding how I got to that moment requires knowing the family dynamics that had been brewing for years. At 26, I thought I had finally figured out how to navigate my relationship with my family while building my own independent life here in Phoenix, Arizona. Working as a junior marketing coordinator at a downtown agency, I was proud of the small apartment I rented near the city center, proud of my growing savings account, and especially proud of my 2019 navy blue Honda Civic that I had purchased just 8 months earlier. That car represented everything I had worked for. While my friends were still borrowing money from their parents or leasing vehicles they couldn't really afford, I had saved diligently for over 2 years to buy something reliable with cash. Every weekend spent at home instead of going out, every lunch packed from home instead of buying takeout, every small sacrifice had led to that moment when I walked into Valley Motors and handed over the check. The salesman, Mr. Thompson, had congratulated me on being such a young person making such a responsible financial decision. I remember driving off the lot that day feeling like I had truly made it into adulthood. My family's reaction to my purchase had been mixed, which should have been my first warning sign. My mother Linda had made comments about how I was becoming too independent and forgetting where I came from, while my father Mark seemed more concerned about whether I could handle the insurance payments and maintenance costs. But it was my younger brother Tyler's response that struck me as the most telling. At 23, Tyler had never held a job for longer than 6 months and still lived at home with our parents in their comfortable Scottsdale house. When he saw my new car, his first words weren't congratulations but rather a complaint about how unfair it was that I got to have nice things while he was stuck taking the bus everywhere. Tyler had always been what you might call the family favorite, though my parents would never admit it outright. Where I had been expected to excel academically and contribute to household chores from a young age, Tyler seemed to float through life with minimal expectations placed on him. When he dropped out of community college after one semester, my parents called it finding his path. When I had struggled with a particularly challenging course during my bachelor's degree, I was told I needed to work harder and figure it out myself. This pattern had repeated itself countless times throughout our lives, but I had always attributed it to birth order differences and tried not to let it bother me too much. The dynamic became more obvious when I started working full-time after college. My parents expected me to contribute to household expenses whenever I visited, help with major family purchases, and generally act as a financial safety net for various family needs. Meanwhile, Tyler's sporadic income from his part-time jobs at various retail stores was treated as his own money to spend however he pleased. When he wanted a new gaming console, it appeared under the Christmas tree. When he needed clothes for job interviews, my mother took him shopping without question. But when I had needed professional attire for my first real job, I was given a lecture about budgeting and directed to discount stores. This favoritism extended beyond financial matters into everyday family interactions. Tyler's opinions were sought out and valued during family discussions, while mine were often dismissed or attributed to my being too serious or uptight. His jokes were met with hearty laughter, while my attempts at humor fell flat. His problems were met with sympathy and immediate offers of help, while mine were treated as learning opportunities that I should handle independently. I had learned to accept this dynamic as simply the way our family functioned, convincing myself that maybe I was just naturally more capable and therefore needed less support. The car situation brought all of these underlying tensions to the surface in ways I hadn't anticipated. Tyler's resentment about my purchase grew more obvious over the following months. He would make snide comments about my fancy ride whenever he saw me, ask to borrow it for dates or social events with increasing frequency, and complain to our parents about how selfish I was being when I declined his requests. I tried to explain that lending a car wasn't like lending a book, that insurance and liability issues made it complicated, but my concerns were brushed aside as me being overly cautious and unwilling to help family. The requests escalated when Tyler announced that he wanted to join his friends for spring break in Cancun. This wasn't just a casual mention of travel dreams, but a detailed plan that he presented to the family as if it were already decided. He had found a package deal that included flights, hotel and meals for a week-long stay at a resort, and he was determined to make it happen. The total cost was nearly $4,000, which might as well have been $4 million given Tyler's employment history and spending habits. Initially, my parents told him that such an expensive vacation wasn't feasible given his current financial situation. They suggested he look for work specifically to save money for the trip, or perhaps consider a less expensive alternative closer to home. For about a week, it seemed like Tyler had accepted this reality and was actually looking into job opportunities with a renewed sense of purpose. I was impressed by his apparent maturity and willingness to work toward a goal, thinking that maybe this could be a turning point for him in terms of personal responsibility. But Tyler's newfound work ethic lasted exactly as long as it took him to realize that earning $4,000 would require months of dedicated employment, and the spring break trip was only 6 weeks away. Rather than accepting that some goals require long-term planning and sacrifice, he began lobbying my parents more intensively. He painted pictures of this being a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, emphasized how all his friends were going, and he would be left out, and gradually began presenting the trip as something he deserved, rather than something he wanted. My parents' resistance began to crumble under Tyler's persistent campaign. They started floating ideas about how to make the trip possible, from taking out a small loan to using money from their emergency fund. Each suggestion made me increasingly uncomfortable, not because I wanted to deny Tyler happiness, but because I could see the pattern repeating itself on a much larger scale. This wasn't just about buying him a new shirt or covering his phone bill, this was about enabling financial irresponsibility in a way that could have lasting consequences for the entire family. During family dinners at their house, Tyler would monopolize conversations with elaborate descriptions of the resort amenities, the excursions he wanted to book, and the memories he would make with his friends. My parents listened with growing enthusiasm, as if his excitement was contagious. They began treating the trip as inevitable rather than conditional, discussing logistics and timing as if the money question had already been resolved. When I tried to interject practical concerns about budgeting and financial priorities, I was met with accusations of being negative and trying to ruin Tyler's dreams. The shift in family dynamics around this trip was subtle but unmistakable. Suddenly I was being painted as the obstacle to Tyler's happiness, rather than the voice of reason I thought I was being. My suggestions that he consider working extra hours, selling some of his possessions, or finding a more affordable alternative were characterized as me being unsupportive and jealous. The narrative somehow became that I was trying to prevent Tyler from having experiences and opportunities, rather than simply advocating for responsible financial planning. What made the situation even more frustrating was that Tyler seemed completely oblivious to the burden his dream vacation was placing on our parents. He spoke about the trip as if money was no object, making additional requests for spending money and upgraded accommodation options. He showed no awareness that funding his vacation might require our parents to make sacrifices in their own lives, or that taking on debt for his leisure activities wasn't a reasonable expectation. His self-centeredness was breathtaking, but what was more troubling was how my parents seemed to view his lack of awareness as charming rather than concerning. As the departure date grew closer and no concrete funding solution had emerged, Tyler's mood began to shift from excited to anxious to increasingly desperate. He started making more frequent trips to my apartment, ostensibly to visit but clearly hoping to borrow money. His requests started small, asking for $20 here and $50 there, always with promises to pay me back quickly. When I realized these small loans were adding up and weren't being repaid, I had an honest conversation with him about my financial boundaries and explained that I couldn't continue lending money that wasn't being returned. Tyler's reaction to my boundary setting was explosive. He accused me of being selfish and caring more about money than family relationships. He claimed that I was jealous of his social life and trying to sabotage his happiness. Most hurtfully, he suggested that I had forgotten what it was like to be young, and that I was turning into a bitter person who couldn't enjoy seeing others succeed. His words stung because they contained just enough truth to make me question myself. Was I being overly rigid about money? Was I letting practical concerns overshadow the importance of supporting family members' dreams? But even as I second-guessed myself, I knew that enabling Tyler's financial irresponsibility wouldn't actually help him in the long run. At 23, he needed to learn that expensive experiences require planning and sacrifice, not just wishful thinking and family guilt trips. I had worked hard for my financial stability, and I wasn't willing to compromise it to fund someone else's vacation, even if that someone was my brother. This decision would prove to be more prescient than I could have imagined, though at the time I simply thought I was protecting my own financial future. The tension in our family continued to build as Tyler's departure date approached, and the funding gap remained unresolved. Family gatherings became uncomfortable affairs, where the elephant in the room was Tyler's increasingly impossible dream vacation. My parents looked stressed and tired, clearly feeling the pressure of wanting to help their son while knowing they couldn't reasonably afford to do so. Tyler alternated between manic optimism and sullen depression, depending on whether he had thought of a new potential solution or had another funding idea fall through. It was during this period of family stress that I began to notice my parents looking at me differently during our conversations. There was a calculating quality to their attention when Tyler's trip came up, as if they were measuring my responses and gauging my potential flexibility. They started making more pointed comments about family loyalty and the importance of supporting each other through challenges.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The suggestions became less subtle that perhaps I could contribute to making Tyler's dream come true, since I was doing so well financially and clearly had money available for things like car purchases. I tried to redirect these conversations by emphasizing that my financial stability had come from careful planning and sacrifice, not from having excess money lying around waiting for family emergencies or vacation funding. I explained that buying my car had required depleting most of my savings and that I was still rebuilding my financial cushion. But my explanations seemed to fall on deaf ears, with my parents apparently believing that my ability to buy a car meant I had unlimited financial resources available for family needs. Looking back, I can see that this was the period when my parents were likely formulating the plan that would eventually destroy our family relationships and force me to make the most difficult decision of my adult life. But at the time, I was focused on trying to maintain my boundaries while supporting my family emotionally, never imagining that they would resort to the extreme measures that were coming. I thought the worst-case scenario would be Tyler missing his trip and learning a hard lesson about financial planning. I never dreamed that my parents would choose to sacrifice our relationship and their own integrity to fund his vacation dreams. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything, though none of us knew it yet. The first real sign that something had shifted dramatically came during what I thought would be a routine family dinner at my parents' house in Scottsdale. It was a Sunday evening in late February, and Tyler's spring break departure was now just 3 weeks away. The atmosphere felt different from the moment I walked through the front door. My parents greeted me with an unusual intensity, their smiles too bright and their questions about my week too detailed. Tyler wasn't his usual sullen self either. Instead, he seemed almost giddy with excitement, bouncing around the kitchen while my mother prepared dinner. During the meal, the conversation kept circling back to Tyler's travel plans with a persistence that made me uncomfortable. My parents asked detailed questions about my work schedule, specifically wanting to know if I had any upcoming business trips or times when I might not need my car for extended periods. When I mentioned that I typically worked from home on Fridays and rarely drove anywhere on weekends unless I had specific plans, Tyler's eyes lit up in a way that should have triggered alarm bells in my mind. My father began what seemed like casual inquiries about my car's value and whether I had considered upgrading to something newer. He wondered aloud if maybe I was ready for a luxury vehicle now that I was established in my career, suggesting that holding on to my Honda Civic might be limiting my professional image. The questions felt oddly specific and persistent, especially coming from a man who had previously praised my practical choice and responsible financial planning. When I responded that I loved my car and had no intention of replacing it anytime soon, I noticed my parents exchange a quick glance that I couldn't quite interpret. Tyler's behavior became increasingly strange over the following week. He started showing up at my apartment at odd hours, claiming he was in the neighborhood or had been running errands nearby. During these visits, he would find excuses to look at my car keys, ask about my parking arrangements, and make comments about how easy it would be for someone to access my vehicle if they really needed to. At the time, I attributed his interest to general car envy and didn't think much of his questions about my daily routines and schedule patterns. But Tyler's inquiries became more systematic and pointed. He wanted to know exactly what time I left for work each morning, whether I always parked in the same spot, and if my apartment complex had security cameras in the parking area. He asked about my spare keys and whether I kept any extra sets at my parents' house or with friends. When I questioned why he needed such detailed information about my transportation habits, he brushed off my concerns with jokes about being curious or potentially borrowing the car for special occasions in the future. The pressure from my parents intensified as well, though in more subtle ways. During phone conversations, they would mention how worried they were about Tyler's disappointment and how his friends had already booked their flights and accommodations. They painted increasingly dramatic pictures of him being left behind and potentially falling into depression or making poor life choices if he couldn't participate in what they now described as a crucial social experience. The narrative had completely shifted from Tyler wanting a vacation to Tyler needing this trip for his emotional and social well-being. My mother started making comments about how successful I had become and how fortunate I was to have so many opportunities that Tyler hadn't experienced. She would sigh deeply when discussing Tyler's situation, as if his lack of funds for an expensive vacation was somehow a tragic circumstance beyond anyone's control, rather than a natural consequence of his choices and priorities. These conversations always ended with not-so-subtle hints that perhaps I could find a way to help make Tyler's dreams come true, since I clearly had the means to do so. The emotional manipulation became more direct when my parents started invoking family loyalty and shared history. They reminded me of times when Tyler had shared his toys with me as children, conveniently forgetting the numerous occasions when he had broken or hidden my belongings out of jealousy. They spoke about the importance of siblings supporting each other through life's challenges, as if funding an expensive vacation qualified as helping with a legitimate life challenge. Most frustrating was their suggestion that my reluctance to contribute financially demonstrated a lack of love and care for my brother's happiness. What made these conversations particularly difficult was that my parents seemed genuinely convinced that their requests were reasonable. They weren't asking me to go into debt or sacrifice my own needs. From their perspective, they were simply asking me to share my good fortune with a family member who was less fortunate. They couldn't or wouldn't understand that my financial stability had come from specific choices and sacrifices, not from lucky circumstances that I should feel obligated to redistribute among family members. During this period, I started noticing that Tyler's friends would sometimes show up at family gatherings or events where I was present. These weren't close family friends or people I had relationships with independently. They were Tyler's drinking buddies and social circle who had never shown interest in family activities before. Their presence felt calculated, especially when they would make comments about how excited they were for their group trip and how disappointed they would be if anyone had to drop out at the last minute. One particularly uncomfortable evening, Tyler's friend Jake cornered me at my parents' house and launched into a detailed description of their planned activities in Cancun. He talked about the group's friendship bond and how this trip would be a milestone experience that they would remember forever. Jake made it clear that the group had already made arrangements assuming Tyler would be joining them, and that his absence would fundamentally change the dynamic of their vacation. The conversation felt like emotional blackmail disguised as friendly enthusiasm. My best friend Chloe Martinez became increasingly concerned about the family pressure I was experiencing. During our regular coffee meetings at Desert Grounds Cafe, she listened to my descriptions of the escalating situation with growing alarm. Chloe had known my family for years and had witnessed the favoritism dynamic firsthand, but even she was surprised by the intensity of their campaign to secure funding for Tyler's vacation. She pointed out that healthy families don't typically pressure one member to subsidize another member's luxury experiences, especially when the person being pressured had worked hard for their own financial stability. Chloe's outside perspective helped me recognize patterns I had been too close to see clearly. She noted that my parents had never asked Tyler to contribute to family expenses or help with household costs, yet they expected me to contribute to his personal entertainment fund. She observed that Tyler had never been required to demonstrate financial responsibility or make sacrifices for his goals, while I had been expected to be self-sufficient and responsible from a young age. Most importantly, she helped me understand that my guilt about setting financial boundaries was a result of years of conditioning rather than actual selfishness on my part. But even with Chloe's support and validation, I found myself wavering under the constant family pressure. The daily phone calls, the guilt-inducing conversations, and Tyler's increasingly desperate behavior were wearing down my resolve. I started questioning whether maintaining my boundaries was worth the family conflict it was creating. Perhaps I could afford to help more than I was admitting to myself. Maybe family harmony was more important than proving a point about financial responsibility. These moments of doubt were exactly what my family was counting on. They sensed my wavering commitment to my boundaries and increased their efforts accordingly. My mother started calling me at work with urgent updates about Tyler's emotional state, describing him as heartbroken and defeated by his inability to join his friends. My father began making comparisons between Tyler's situation and times when I had received family support, conveniently rewriting history to make it seem as if I had been given advantages that were now being unfairly denied to my brother. Tyler himself became increasingly manipulative in his approach. He would show up at my apartment looking genuinely distressed, sometimes with tears in his eyes, as he described how isolated and left out he felt. He talked about how this situation was affecting his mental health and his relationships with his friends. He promised that if I could just help him this one time, he would never ask for anything again and would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. His performances were convincing because they contained elements of genuine emotion, even though the underlying premise was fundamentally flawed. The breaking point in this escalating pressure campaign came during a family meeting that my parents specifically requested. They invited me to dinner and said they wanted to have an honest conversation about Tyler's situation and potential solutions. I arrived expecting a rational discussion about budgeting, timeline adjustments, or alternative vacation options. Instead, I walked into what felt like an intervention designed to break down my resistance and secure my financial contribution to Tyler's spring break fund. My parents had prepared what amounted to a presentation about why helping Tyler was not just the right thing to do, but the only acceptable choice for a loving sister. They had calculated exactly how much money I would need to contribute to make the trip possible, worked out a payment plan that they claimed would be painless for someone in my financial position, and prepared responses to every objection they anticipated I might raise. The level of planning and coordination involved in their pitch was both impressive and deeply disturbing. When I tried to explain my perspective and concerns, my words were met with immediate dismissal and counter-arguments. My parents had an answer for everything, from assurances that Tyler would pay me back eventually to guarantees that this would be a one-time request that would never be repeated. They spoke about family investments and mutual support, as if funding Tyler's vacation was equivalent to contributing to a family emergency or helping with legitimate financial hardship. The most shocking part of this family meeting was when my parents revealed that they had already committed to Tyler that the trip would happen, regardless of where the money came from. They had told him to go ahead and finalize his booking and had assured his friends that he would definitely be joining them.
In other words, they had made promises about my money without consulting me, assuming that family pressure would eventually wear down my resistance and secure my cooperation. When I expressed anger about decisions being made with my money without my consent, my parents seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction. They couldn't understand why I was upset about them planning Tyler's financial future around my potential contribution. From their perspective, my objections were selfish obstacles to overcome rather than legitimate concerns to address. They had already mentally spent my money and couldn't comprehend why I wasn't grateful for the opportunity to make Tyler happy. Tyler's reaction to my continued resistance was the most revealing of all. Rather than acknowledging that he had no right to expect financial support for his vacation, he became angry and accusatory. He claimed that I was jealous of his social life and trying to sabotage his happiness out of spite. He accused me of having more money than I needed and being too selfish to share with family. Most painfully, he suggested that I had become a different person since becoming financially independent, someone who cared more about money than family relationships. The family meeting ended with my parents issuing what amounted to an ultimatum disguised as a request. They gave me 1 week to reconsider my position and find a way to contribute to Tyler's vacation fund. They suggested that my continued refusal would be interpreted as a rejection of family values and a sign that I had outgrown my need for family relationships. The implication was clear: fund Tyler's trip or face ongoing family conflict and potential estrangement. As I drove home that night, I felt emotionally drained and completely overwhelmed by the situation. The family I had grown up with seemed to have transformed into strangers who viewed me primarily as a financial resource rather than a person with my own needs and boundaries. The Tyler I remembered as a sometimes annoying but generally lovable younger brother had become someone I barely recognized, consumed with entitlement and resentment. Most devastating was realizing that my parents, who I had always respected despite their favoritism patterns, were willing to manipulate and pressure me in ways that felt fundamentally wrong. That week of consideration they had requested became a period of intense reflection and planning. I knew that whatever decision I made would have lasting consequences for my family relationships. If I gave in to their pressure, I would be setting a precedent that my boundaries could be worn down through persistent manipulation. If I maintained my position, I would likely face ongoing conflict and possible estrangement from the people who had shaped my early life. But what I didn't know during that week of reflection was that my family had already moved beyond trying to convince me to contribute voluntarily. While I was weighing my options and considering various compromise solutions, they were finalizing a plan that would bypass my consent entirely and take what they believed they were entitled to. The respect for my autonomy and decision-making that I thought still existed was about to be revealed as completely illusory. The signs of their escalating desperation should have been more obvious in retrospect. Tyler's sudden shifts between manic excitement and deep depression suggested that promises had been made and expectations set that went beyond anything I had agreed to. My parents' increasing questions about my daily routines and car usage patterns weren't casual curiosity but intelligence gathering for a plan I couldn't have imagined they were capable of executing. The week passed with minimal communication from my family, which I initially interpreted as them giving me space to make my decision. In reality, they were probably avoiding contact to prevent any conversations that might reveal their true intentions or make them reconsider the extreme measures they were preparing to take. Their silence wasn't respect for my autonomy, it was the calm before a storm that would fundamentally alter our family relationships forever. The morning I discovered my car was gone started like any other Thursday in March. I had finished my usual routine of checking emails over coffee and was gathering my things for the drive to downtown Phoenix when I glanced out my apartment window toward the parking area. The familiar sight of my navy blue Honda Civic was missing from its usual spot, leaving an empty space that made my stomach drop instantly. My first thought was that I was looking at the wrong area or had somehow misremembered where I had parked the night before. I rushed downstairs in my pajamas and slippers, convinced that I would find my car in a different section of the complex parking lot. Maybe I had been distracted when I came home and had automatically pulled into a visitor space instead of my assigned spot. But after checking every possible location where my vehicle could reasonably be, the reality began to sink in. My car was genuinely gone, and I had no idea where it could be or what had happened to it. The immediate assumption was theft, which sent my mind racing through all the practical concerns that come with having your primary transportation stolen. I would need to call the police, contact my insurance company, figure out how to get to work, and deal with the massive inconvenience of replacing all the personal items I kept in my vehicle. But beyond the practical concerns was a deeper sense of violation and loss. That car represented years of careful saving and responsible financial planning, and someone had simply taken it as if my hard work and sacrifice meant nothing. Standing in the empty parking space where my car should have been, I called the Phoenix Police Department to report the theft. The dispatcher was professional and efficient, taking down all the relevant information about my vehicle and arranging for an officer to come take a formal report. Officer Davis arrived within an hour, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor who had clearly handled countless auto theft cases. She walked me through the standard questions about when I had last seen the vehicle, whether I had any enemies or people who might want to harm me, and if I had noticed any suspicious activity in the area recently. Officer Davis examined the empty parking space and the surrounding area for any signs of forced entry or evidence of how the theft had occurred. What puzzled both of us was the complete absence of broken glass, discarded items, or any other indicators typically associated with car theft. Professional thieves usually left some trace of their methods, whether it was damage to the ignition system or scattered personal belongings they didn't want. The scene was remarkably clean, as if my car had simply vanished into thin air. While we were discussing the unusual circumstances of the theft, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson approached us with information that would change everything. She was an elderly woman who spent much of her time watching the neighborhood from her front window and was remarkably observant about the comings and goings of residents and visitors. Mrs. Patterson told Officer Davis that she had seen my car being driven away early that morning, around 6:30, but what made her account significant was her description of the driver. According to Mrs. Patterson, the person behind the wheel was a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s with brown hair and a medium build. She had noticed him because he had seemed to know exactly where he was going and had handled the car with familiarity rather than the nervous haste typical of someone stealing an unfamiliar vehicle. Most importantly, she had seen him the day before walking around the parking area and looking at different cars, behavior that had struck her as odd at the time but hadn't seemed threatening enough to report. Officer Davis asked Mrs. Patterson if she would be able to identify the person if she saw him again, and she expressed confidence that she could. The description she provided was detailed enough to be useful but general enough that it could have matched hundreds of young men in the Phoenix area. However, something about her account was triggering a growing sense of dread in my mind. The age range, the physical description, and especially the familiarity with which the person had operated my vehicle were pointing toward a possibility I didn't want to consider. During the formal report process, Officer Davis asked about my family relationships and whether anyone close to me might have had access to my car keys or knowledge of my daily routines. The question felt invasive and absurd at first because the idea that someone in my family could be involved in stealing my car was beyond anything I could have imagined. But as I thought about Tyler's recent behavior, his detailed questions about my schedule and parking arrangements, and the family's escalating pressure about his vacation funding, pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to fall into place. I found myself reluctantly sharing with Officer Davis the recent family tensions and my brother's financial situation. I explained the pressure I had been under to contribute to his spring break trip and his increasing desperation as the departure date approached. Officer Davis listened with growing interest, particularly when I mentioned Tyler's detailed questions about my car and his unusual visits to my apartment complex. Her expression became more serious as I described the family meeting and the ultimatum my parents had issued about reconsidering my financial contribution. Officer Davis asked whether Tyler had ever had access to my car keys or my apartment, questions that made me realize how naive I had been about protecting my personal property from family members. Tyler had been to my apartment numerous times in recent weeks and had often been left alone while I prepared drinks or used the bathroom. My spare car key was kept in a small dish near my front door, a location that would have been easily visible to anyone spending time in my living area. The possibility that my own brother had stolen my car was devastating to consider, but the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The police report was filed with Tyler listed as a person of interest, though Officer Davis explained that they would need more concrete evidence before taking any action against him. She suggested that I contact my family members to see if anyone had information about my car's whereabouts, advice that felt both necessary and terrifying. If Tyler had indeed taken my vehicle, confronting my family about it would expose the theft and force a reckoning that would permanently damage our relationships. I decided to start with a phone call to my parents' house, hoping that my suspicions were wrong and that there would be some innocent explanation for my car's disappearance. My mother answered the phone with unusual brightness, immediately asking how my day was going and whether anything interesting was happening in my life. Her cheerful demeanor felt forced and inappropriate given that I was calling to report a serious crime, but I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. When I explained that my car had been stolen and that I was dealing with police reports and insurance claims, my mother's reaction was strangely muted. Rather than expressing shock, concern, or sympathy, she made vague comments about how unfortunate the situation was and how these things happened in big cities. She seemed more interested in asking about my work schedule and whether the theft would affect my ability to get around, than in offering emotional support or practical assistance during what should have been a crisis. My father's response was similarly odd when he took the phone. He asked detailed questions about what the police had told me, whether they had any leads or suspects, and how long the investigation process typically took. His inquiries felt more like information gathering than genuine concern, as if he were trying to assess the severity of the situation rather than help me deal with it. Most telling was his immediate suggestion that I contact my insurance company to see about getting a rental car, advice that seemed focused on maintaining my independence rather than offering family support during a difficult time. The conversation with my parents left me feeling more suspicious rather than reassured. Their responses were too controlled, too focused on practical details, and completely lacking in the emotional reaction I would have expected from people who cared about my well-being. When I mentioned that the police were investigating and might need to talk to people who knew me, both my parents became noticeably more tense and began asking specific questions about what information I had provided to Officer Davis. Tyler was not at my parents' house when I called, which they explained by saying he was out running errands and preparing for his upcoming trip. The mention of his travel plans in the context of my car theft felt particularly jarring, especially when my mother casually mentioned that Tyler had seemed especially excited and energetic that morning. When I asked where Tyler was planning to go for his errands, my parents became vague and evasive, claiming they weren't sure of his exact itinerary. After ending the call with my parents, I felt more convinced than ever that Tyler was somehow involved in my car's disappearance. The family's behavior was too strange, too controlled, and too focused on gathering information about the police investigation to be coincidental. But even as the evidence mounted, I struggled to accept that my own family could have betrayed me so completely. The idea that they would steal from me to fund Tyler's vacation was beyond anything I had thought them capable of. Chloe arrived at my apartment within an hour of my calling her about the situation. She had taken time off work to come support me, expecting to find me dealing with the trauma of being a crime victim. Instead, she found me pacing around my living room, trying to process the possibility that my own family had orchestrated the theft of my vehicle. Chloe listened to my account of the morning's events and my parents' strange reactions with growing alarm and anger. What struck Chloe most was how quickly my family had seemed to accept and move past the news of my car being stolen. In her experience, when something traumatic happened to a family member, relatives typically dropped everything to offer support and assistance. The fact that my parents had remained focused on Tyler's travel plans and seemed more concerned about the police investigation than my well-being suggested that they had known about the theft in advance. Chloe encouraged me to trust my instincts about Tyler's involvement and to take whatever steps were necessary to recover my property and hold the responsible parties accountable. She pointed out that if Tyler had indeed stolen my car, allowing the theft to go unreported or unpunished would only enable future criminal behavior and signal that family relationships could be used to avoid consequences for serious wrongdoing. Her perspective helped me understand that protecting Tyler from the consequences of his actions would ultimately be harmful to everyone involved. As the day progressed, my suspicions about Tyler's involvement became impossible to ignore. Officer Davis called to inform me that they had received a tip about a vehicle matching my car's description being seen at Valley Motors, the dealership where I had originally purchased it. When she asked whether I had any reason to believe someone might try to sell my car, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place with devastating clarity. Tyler hadn't just stolen my car for temporary use or to spite me for refusing to fund his vacation. He had taken it with the intention of selling it to raise money for his spring break trip. The detailed questions he had asked about the vehicle's value, his inquiries about my spare keys, and his careful observation of my daily routines had all been preparation for a calculated theft designed to solve his financial problems at my expense. The betrayal was so complete and so coldly planned that I could barely process the magnitude of what had happened. Officer Davis arranged to meet me at Valley Motors to investigate whether someone had attempted to sell my vehicle. Mr. Thompson, the salesman who had originally sold me the car, was visibly shocked when we explained the situation. He confirmed that a young man matching Tyler's description had been at the dealership that morning, claiming to be selling a Honda Civic on behalf of his sister who was moving out of state for work. The paperwork he had provided included a forged power of attorney document with my signature and a bill of sale that listed him as my authorized representative. Thompson had found the transaction somewhat unusual because the young man had seemed nervous and had been asking for immediate cash payment rather than following normal procedures. However, the paperwork had appeared legitimate, and the person had known specific details about the car's purchase history and maintenance that suggested familiarity with the vehicle. The dealership had been in the process of completing the sale when Officer Davis's inquiry had prompted them to investigate further. The discovery that Tyler had actually succeeded in selling my car to the dealership was devastating beyond anything I could have imagined. This wasn't an impulsive act of desperation or a temporary borrowing that had gotten out of hand. Tyler had committed a serious felony involving forgery, theft, and fraud, all to fund a vacation that he felt entitled to take regardless of his financial circumstances. The planning and premeditation involved in his crime made it impossible to dismiss as a momentary lapse in judgment or a family misunderstanding. Officer Davis explained that the evidence against Tyler was now substantial enough to warrant immediate action. The forged documents, the witness testimony from Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Thompson, and his access to my keys and knowledge of my routines, created a strong case for auto theft and fraud charges. She would be issuing a warrant for Tyler's arrest and would need me to provide a formal statement about the family pressures and his recent behavior that had led up to the theft. The moment when I had to decide whether to press charges against my own brother was one of the most difficult of my entire life. On one hand, Tyler had committed serious crimes that would normally result in significant legal consequences. On the other hand, pursuing criminal charges would destroy our family relationships permanently and potentially ruin Tyler's future prospects. The choice between justice and family loyalty felt impossible to make, but I knew that allowing Tyler to escape consequences for his actions would only enable further criminal behavior. Standing in the Valley Motors parking lot with Officer Davis, looking at the paperwork documenting Tyler's attempted sale of my stolen vehicle, I made the decision that would change everything. I told Officer Davis that I wanted to pursue full criminal charges against Tyler for auto theft, forgery, and fraud. The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth, but I knew that protecting Tyler from the consequences of his choices would ultimately be a disservice to him and to any future victims of his criminal behavior. Officer Davis nodded with understanding and began explaining the legal process that would follow. Tyler would be arrested and charged with multiple felonies, which could result in significant jail time and permanent criminal record consequences. My parents, if they had been involved in planning or facilitating the theft, could potentially face charges as accessories to the crime. The investigation would likely involve searches of their property and detailed questioning about their knowledge of Tyler's actions. As I signed the formal complaint that would initiate criminal proceedings against my brother, I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Relief that my car would be returned, and that Tyler would face appropriate consequences for his actions. Sadness that our family relationships had deteriorated to the point where criminal charges were necessary. And determination to follow through with the legal process, regardless of the family pressure and emotional manipulation that I knew would follow. The decision to press charges marked the end of my willingness to enable Tyler's irresponsible behavior and my parents' favoritism. It was the moment when I chose my own well-being and principles over family harmony and unconditional loyalty. The consequences of that decision would unfold over the following months in ways that would test every aspect of my character and resolve, but I knew that I had finally taken a stand that reflected my true values and boundaries. Tyler's arrest happened faster than I had anticipated. Officer Davis contacted me the next morning to inform me that they had located him at my parents' house and taken him into custody without incident. The speed of the arrest suggested that Tyler hadn't tried to flee or hide, which meant he either didn't understand the severity of his actions or had been convinced by my parents that family connections would somehow protect him from legal consequences. Either way, his lack of preparation for the criminal justice system he was about to face demonstrated the same poor judgment that had led to the theft in the first place. My parents' reaction to Tyler's arrest was immediate and explosive. Within 2 hours of Tyler being taken to the Phoenix PD Central Precinct, my phone began ringing with calls that I initially chose not to answer. The voicemails they left escalated quickly from confused questions about what was happening to angry demands that I fix the situation immediately. My mother's voice became increasingly shrill as she insisted that I was destroying the family over a simple misunderstanding, while my father's messages grew more threatening as he accused me of betraying my own blood for the sake of a material possession. When I finally answered one of their calls, the conversation was unlike anything I had ever experienced with my parents. My mother was crying hysterically, alternating between begging me to drop the charges and screaming that I was an ungrateful daughter who had forgotten everything they had done for me. My father's anger was more controlled, but somehow more disturbing, as he coldly informed me that I had made a choice that would have permanent consequences for our family relationships. The implication was clear: if I didn't immediately rectify the situation by withdrawing my complaint, I would be disowned and cut off from the family permanently. What struck me most about their reaction was the complete absence of any acknowledgement that Tyler had committed serious crimes. Neither of my parents expressed any surprise about his actions, any disappointment in his choices, or any understanding of why I might be upset about having my car stolen and sold. Instead, they seemed to view Tyler's arrest as an attack on the family, rather than a natural consequence of criminal behavior. Their focus was entirely on minimizing the situation and protecting Tyler from accountability, not on addressing the underlying issues that had led to this crisis. My parents demanded an immediate meeting to discuss what they called a family emergency. They wanted me to come to their house that evening so we could work together to resolve the situation before it got any worse. The way they framed the request suggested that they still believed this was a problem that could be solved through family negotiation, rather than a criminal matter that was now in the hands of the legal system. Their inability to grasp the seriousness of the situation was both frustrating and revealing of how disconnected they were from reality.
I agreed to meet with them, but not at their house where they would have the psychological advantage of familiar territory and where Tyler might be present if he made bail. Instead, I suggested we meet at Desert Grounds Cafe, the same place where Chloe and I had discussed the escalating family pressures over the previous weeks. The neutral location would prevent them from staging an intervention-style confrontation and would ensure that our conversation remained civil and focused. Chloe insisted on accompanying me to this meeting, both for moral support and as a witness to whatever was said. She had watched the family dynamic deteriorate over the past months and was deeply concerned about my parents' willingness to manipulate and pressure me. Having her there would also prevent my parents from later claiming that I had misunderstood their words or taken their statements out of context, something they had done frequently during previous family conflicts.
My parents arrived at the cafe looking haggard and stressed, but also determined in a way that suggested they had spent considerable time planning their approach to this conversation. They had clearly coordinated their strategy because they immediately launched into what felt like a rehearsed presentation about family loyalty, forgiveness, and the importance of protecting Tyler's future. They spoke in turns, each picking up where the other left off, as if they had practiced their talking points in advance. My mother began with an emotional appeal about Tyler's youth and inexperience, painting him as a naive young man who had made a mistake rather than an adult who had committed premeditated crimes. She talked about how a criminal record would ruin his life prospects and prevent him from ever achieving his potential. According to her narrative, Tyler's theft of my car was an impulsive act born of desperation rather than a calculated crime involving forgery and fraud. She conveniently ignored the evidence of planning and premeditation that had been uncovered during the police investigation. My father took a more practical approach, focusing on the financial and legal costs of pursuing criminal charges. He outlined the expenses involved in the legal process, the time commitment required for court appearances, and the emotional toll that a family criminal case would take on everyone involved. He suggested that we could resolve the situation more efficiently through private family negotiations, with Tyler paying restitution and agreeing to counseling or other remedial measures. His proposal essentially amounted to letting Tyler buy his way out of criminal accountability. What was most disturbing about their presentation was how they had completely rewritten the events leading up to Tyler's arrest. According to their version of events, Tyler had borrowed my car with the intention of returning it, but had panicked when he realized he couldn't afford his vacation and had made a poor decision to try selling it temporarily. They claimed that his use of forged documents was simply a misguided attempt to expedite a transaction he planned to reverse before I noticed the car was missing. Their creative revisionist history ignored the timeline of events and the evidence of premeditation that made their story impossible to believe. Throughout their presentation, my parents consistently referred to Tyler's crimes as mistakes, misunderstandings, or poor choices rather than acknowledging the serious legal violations he had committed. They seemed genuinely convinced that family relationships should supersede legal accountability and that my willingness to involve law enforcement in a family matter demonstrated disloyalty and vindictiveness on my part. Their worldview appeared to include a fundamental belief that family members should be exempt from normal social and legal consequences. When they finished their prepared remarks, my parents looked at me expectantly, clearly anticipating that their arguments would convince me to drop the charges and handle the situation privately. The silence that followed was uncomfortable as I processed everything they had said and prepared my response. Chloe's presence beside me was reassuring because I knew that at least one person in the room understood the magnitude of what Tyler had done and supported my decision to seek legal accountability. My response began with a systematic dismantling of their revisionist narrative. I pointed out that Tyler's theft had involved detailed planning, from his reconnaissance visits to my apartment complex to his preparation of forged legal documents. I explained that his actions constituted multiple felonies that would have been prosecuted regardless of family relationships if he had stolen from a stranger. Most importantly, I emphasized that his crime had been motivated not by desperation but by entitlement and a belief that he could take whatever he needed from others to fund his lifestyle choices. I told my parents that their immediate focus on protecting Tyler from consequences rather than addressing his criminal behavior was exactly the kind of enabling that had led to this situation. Their history of excusing his irresponsibility and providing him with whatever he wanted had created a young man who believed rules didn't apply to him and that family resources were available for his personal use regardless of consent. By shielding him from accountability once again, they would only reinforce these dangerous beliefs and increase the likelihood of future criminal behavior. My father's reaction to my refusal to drop the charges was swift and harsh. He informed me that if I continued with the legal proceedings, I would no longer be welcome in their home and would be cut off from all family financial support or assistance. He made it clear that they viewed my decision as a betrayal that warranted permanent consequences and that they would not maintain relationships with someone who was willing to destroy Tyler's life over material possessions. His ultimatum was designed to force me to choose between justice and family relationships. My mother's approach was more manipulative but equally destructive. She began crying and claiming that my actions were causing her severe emotional distress and health problems. She described sleepless nights worrying about Tyler's future and panic attacks triggered by thoughts of him in jail. According to her account, my insistence on pressing charges was essentially torturing her and causing psychological damage that might require medical intervention. Her goal was clearly to make me feel responsible for her well-being and guilty about the consequences of my decisions. The most revealing moment of the entire conversation came when I asked my parents directly whether they had known about Tyler's plan to steal and sell my car. The question caught them off guard, and their immediate defensive reactions confirmed what I had suspected. My father began talking about how Tyler had mentioned needing transportation help, while my mother claimed that they had assumed he was borrowing the car with my permission. Their explanations were contradictory and unconvincing, suggesting that they had at minimum been willfully ignorant about Tyler's criminal intentions. When I pressed them for more details about their knowledge of Tyler's actions, their stories began to fall apart completely. My father admitted that Tyler had asked them about the value of my car and whether they thought I would eventually need to sell it for financial reasons. My mother acknowledged that Tyler had mentioned visiting my apartment complex to check on my parking situation, supposedly out of concern for my safety. Their admissions painted a picture of parents who had been aware that something inappropriate was being planned but had chosen not to investigate or intervene. The realization that my parents had been complicit in Tyler's crime, even if only through willful ignorance and passive enablement, was devastating. They had allowed their favoritism and indulgence to blind them to clear warning signs that their son was planning to commit serious crimes against their daughter. Their failure to protect me from Tyler's criminal behavior while simultaneously demanding that I protect him from legal consequences revealed the fundamental dysfunction in our family relationships. Chloe, who had remained silent throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke up to defend my decision and point out the flaws in my parents' reasoning. She noted that their focus on Tyler's potential consequences ignored the harm that had been done to me, both financially and emotionally. She observed that their willingness to cut me off from the family for seeking legal accountability demonstrated that their love was conditional on my willingness to enable Tyler's bad behavior. Her outside perspective helped clarify the manipulative nature of their arguments and the unreasonable expectations they were placing on me. My parents' reaction to Chloe's intervention was telling. Rather than addressing her points or acknowledging the validity of her observations, they became angry that I had brought an outsider into family business and accused Chloe of poisoning my mind against them. Their inability to engage with criticism or different perspectives revealed how insulated they had become from reality and how invested they were in maintaining their dysfunctional family dynamic. The meeting ended with my parents delivering a final ultimatum. They gave me 24 hours to drop the charges against Tyler and agree to handle the situation privately, or they would consider our family relationships permanently severed. They claimed that this was my last chance to choose family over vindictiveness and that my decision would reveal my true character. Their framing of the situation as a choice between family loyalty and personal vendetta demonstrated their complete inability to understand the principles and boundaries that guided my decision-making. As my parents left the cafe, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I was watching relationships that had shaped my entire life crumble beyond repair. Relief because I was finally free from the obligation to manage their emotions and enable their dysfunction. Their ultimatum had actually simplified my situation by making it clear that maintaining relationships with them would require sacrificing my principles and self-respect. Chloe and I remained at the cafe for another hour, processing what had just happened and discussing the implications of my parents' ultimatum. She helped me understand that their willingness to disown me for seeking legal accountability revealed the conditional nature of their love and the unhealthy dynamics that had always existed in our family. She also pointed out that Tyler's criminal behavior and my parents' enabling response were likely to continue escalating if not addressed through proper legal channels. That evening, I received several more phone calls from family members and friends who had been contacted by my parents seeking support for their position. My aunt called to express disappointment in my willingness to send Tyler to jail over a car. A family friend left a voicemail asking me to reconsider my harsh response to what she described as a family misunderstanding. Even some of Tyler's friends reached out to plead for leniency and described the impact that criminal charges would have on his life and opportunities. The coordinated campaign to pressure me into dropping the charges revealed how extensively my parents had mobilized their social network to support their position. They had clearly spent considerable time and energy contacting everyone they could think of who might be willing to advocate for Tyler and criticize my decision. The fact that they were able to recruit so many people to their cause suggested that they had been successful in controlling the narrative and presenting Tyler as a victim rather than a perpetrator. What struck me most about the various calls and messages was how none of the people advocating for Tyler seemed to understand the serious nature of his crimes. They spoke about car borrowing, family misunderstandings, and youthful mistakes rather than acknowledging the theft, forgery, and fraud that had actually occurred. My parents had apparently been successful in minimizing Tyler's actions and portraying me as overreacting to a minor family dispute. Despite the pressure from multiple sources, I felt increasingly confident that my decision to pursue criminal charges was correct. The coordinated campaign to change my mind actually reinforced my belief that Tyler had been enabled and protected from consequences for too long. The fact that so many people were willing to help him avoid accountability for serious crimes demonstrated exactly why legal intervention was necessary to break the cycle of enabling behavior. As the 24-hour deadline my parents had imposed approached, I prepared for the conversation that would formally end our family relationships. I had already made my decision and would not be dropping the charges regardless of the personal consequences. Tyler would face appropriate legal accountability for his crimes, and I would face whatever family consequences resulted from that decision. The choice between justice and family approval was ultimately no choice at all, because maintaining relationships that required me to compromise my fundamental principles was not sustainable or healthy. The 24 hours my parents had given me to reconsider passed without any contact from me, which served as my answer to their ultimatum. I spent that time reflecting on the decision I had made and preparing myself for the long-term consequences of choosing legal accountability over family harmony. When my father called the next evening, his voice was cold and formal as he informed me that I was no longer considered part of their family and that any future contact would be unwelcome. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it officially ended relationships that had defined my entire life up to that point. Tyler's legal proceedings moved forward with surprising efficiency. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the forged documents, witness testimony, and his own admission to the police that he had taken and sold my car. His public defender advised him to accept a plea agreement rather than risk a trial that would likely result in more severe consequences. The prosecution offered a deal that included restitution, probation, community service, and a felony conviction that would remain on his permanent record. Tyler ultimately accepted the plea, avoiding jail time but ensuring that his criminal behavior would have lasting professional and personal consequences. The restitution process required Tyler to repay not only the full value of my car but also the costs associated with the police investigation, legal proceedings, and the inconvenience I had experienced during the weeks when my vehicle was unavailable. The total amount exceeded $8,000, significantly more than the cost of the Cancun vacation that had motivated his crime in the first place. My parents ultimately had to cover most of the restitution payments because Tyler's part-time employment could never generate that kind of money within the court-mandated time frame. What surprised me most about the legal resolution was how quickly Tyler seemed to accept responsibility for his actions once he was removed from my parents' enabling influence. During the restitution hearing, he offered a genuine apology for his crimes and acknowledged that his behavior had been completely unacceptable regardless of his financial pressures or family dynamics. He admitted that he had known his actions were wrong when he committed them and that he had been counting on family protection to avoid serious consequences. His acknowledgement of responsibility suggested that he had been capable of better judgment all along but had been corrupted by years of enablement and lack of accountability. The contrast between Tyler's eventual acceptance of responsibility and my parents' continued denial was stark and revealing. Even after Tyler had pled guilty and expressed remorse, my parents maintained that I had overreacted to a family situation and destroyed relationships over material possessions. They seemed incapable of understanding that Tyler's crimes had been serious violations that warranted legal consequences, preferring to view the entire situation as a personal attack on their family rather than a natural result of criminal behavior. 6 months after Tyler's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call from him requesting a meeting to discuss our relationship and his desire to make amends beyond the court-mandated restitution. He had completed his community service requirements and was working full-time at a warehouse job that provided steady income and health benefits. More importantly, he claimed to have gained perspective on his past behavior and wanted to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect rather than the dysfunctional family dynamics that had led to his crimes. Our meeting took place at a neutral location, a small restaurant downtown where we could have a private conversation without the emotional weight of familiar settings. Tyler looked different than I remembered, more mature and serious, as if the legal consequences of his actions had forced him to grow up in ways that years of family enabling had prevented. He began our conversation with a comprehensive apology that went beyond his crimes to acknowledge the broader pattern of entitlement and disrespect that had characterized his behavior toward me for years. Tyler explained that his time in counseling, which had been part of his plea agreement, had helped him understand how his parents' favoritism had damaged both of us in different ways. He recognized that their willingness to excuse his behavior and meet his demands had prevented him from developing personal responsibility and realistic expectations about life. More importantly, he acknowledged that their treatment of me as a secondary priority and financial resource had been fundamentally unfair and harmful to my well-being. During our conversation, Tyler revealed information about my parents' involvement in his car theft scheme that I had suspected but never been able to prove. He admitted that they had known about his plan in advance and had helped him research the process of selling vehicles and creating the necessary documentation. While they hadn't explicitly encouraged him to commit crimes, they had provided practical assistance while maintaining plausible deniability about their knowledge of his illegal intentions. Their level of complicity had been greater than I had realized and explained their desperate efforts to avoid legal accountability. Tyler also shared details about how my parents had reacted to his arrest and conviction that revealed the extent of their dysfunction and denial. Rather than using his legal troubles as an opportunity to reflect on their parenting choices and family dynamics, they had doubled down on their belief that I was the problem and that Tyler was simply an unfortunate victim of my vindictiveness. They had spent considerable money on legal fees and restitution while continuing to view themselves as the injured parties in the situation. What struck me most about Tyler's account was how his criminal conviction and its consequences had ultimately been liberating for him. The legal system had provided the external accountability that my parents had never been willing to impose, forcing him to confront the reality of his choices and their consequences. His probation officer, counselor, and employer had all held him to standards of behavior and responsibility that were completely foreign to his previous family experience, but had ultimately helped him develop genuine self-respect and realistic life goals. Tyler's transformation was evident not just in his words but in his actions and demeanor. He had maintained steady employment for longer than ever before, was living independently in his own apartment, and was taking community college courses to develop job skills and career prospects. Most importantly, he was no longer making demands on others or expecting special treatment because of family relationships. The person sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the entitled and irresponsible young man who had stolen my car less than a year earlier. Our conversation lasted nearly 3 hours as we worked through years of family dysfunction, resentment, and misunderstanding. Tyler acknowledged that rebuilding our relationship would require time and consistent demonstration of his changed behavior rather than simply expressing remorse and making promises. He understood that trust had to be earned through actions rather than words, and he was prepared to invest whatever time and effort was necessary to prove that his transformation was genuine and lasting. When Tyler asked about the possibility of eventually rebuilding relationships with our parents, I was honest about my belief that such reconciliation was unlikely unless they were willing to acknowledge their role in creating the family dynamics that had led to his criminal behavior. Their continued denial and blame-shifting suggested that they were not capable of the kind of honest self-reflection that would be necessary for healthy family relationships. Tyler seemed to understand and accept that his relationship with me might develop separately from any future contact with our parents. As we parted that day, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of eventually having a genuine relationship with my brother. His transformation seemed authentic, and his understanding of the work required to rebuild trust was realistic and mature. While I remained guarded about fully trusting him again, I was willing to consider the possibility that people could genuinely change when held accountable for their actions and removed from enabling environments. The following months brought periodic contact between Tyler and me as we slowly rebuilt our relationship through small, low-stakes interactions. He would occasionally text to share updates about his job or school progress, always respecting my boundaries about frequency and content of communication. When I needed help moving to a larger apartment, he offered assistance without expecting anything in return, and proved reliable and respectful throughout the process. These small interactions gradually rebuilt my confidence in his character and commitment to change. My parents made several attempts to contact me during this period, usually around holidays or family events, but their messages always focused on my perceived wrongdoing rather than acknowledging their own role in our family's destruction. They seemed to believe that enough time had passed for me to forgive and forget their behavior, without any recognition that forgiveness would require acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to change. Their inability to take responsibility for their actions made reconciliation impossible, regardless of my willingness to rebuild family relationships. 2 years after Tyler's conviction, we had developed what I would describe as a cautiously positive sibling relationship. We met regularly for coffee or meals, celebrated each other's achievements and milestones, and provided mutual support during challenging times. Tyler had completed his probation successfully, earned an associate degree in automotive technology, and was working as a certified mechanic at a reputable shop. More importantly, he had maintained his commitment to personal responsibility and honest communication throughout our relationship rebuilding process. The most significant test of our renewed relationship came when Tyler was offered a job opportunity in another state that would advance his career but require him to relocate. He consulted with me about the decision, not because he needed my permission but because he valued my perspective and wanted to maintain our relationship despite the distance. His approach to this major life decision demonstrated the maturity and consideration that had been completely absent from his behavior during our family crisis years earlier. Tyler's successful rehabilitation and our relationship rebuilding gave me hope that positive change was possible even after serious betrayals and criminal behavior. His willingness to accept accountability, do the hard work of personal growth, and invest time and energy in rebuilding trust had created possibilities that I never would have imagined during the darkest days of our family crisis. While our relationship would never be the same as it had been before his crimes, it was in many ways healthier and more honest than it had ever been previously. My parents, in contrast, remained trapped in the same patterns of denial and blame that had created our family dysfunction in the first place. Their inability to acknowledge their mistakes or take responsibility for their role in enabling Tyler's criminal behavior meant that they continued to live in a distorted reality where they were victims rather than contributors to our family's problems. This ongoing dysfunction made reconciliation impossible and served as a reminder of how toxic enabling behavior could become. The experience of having my car stolen by my own brother and navigating the legal and family consequences had taught me invaluable lessons about boundaries, accountability, and the difference between enabling and supporting. I learned that true love sometimes requires allowing people to face the consequences of their actions rather than protecting them from accountability. I discovered that family relationships based on manipulation and conditional love were ultimately unsustainable and harmful to everyone involved. Most importantly, I learned that choosing principles over popularity and justice over family harmony had ultimately led to better outcomes for everyone involved. Tyler's criminal conviction had forced him to develop the personal responsibility and self-respect that years of enabling had prevented. My decision to press charges had protected other potential victims from his criminal behavior and demonstrated that actions have consequences regardless of family relationships. As I reflect on this experience now, I feel grateful for the hard lessons it taught me about family dynamics, personal boundaries, and the importance of accountability. While the immediate consequences were painful and disruptive, the long-term results included genuine personal growth, healthier relationships, and a clearer understanding of my own values and priorities. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to allow them to face the natural consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are severe and the process is emotionally difficult for everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.